Today we discuss the future of China's economy with Dr. Liang. Hey everyone, I'm Jason Smith. I'm originally from sunny California, now living in beautiful Beijing. Today's guest is Liang, a professor of economics at Willamette University. Dr. Liang specializes in modern monetary theory, the political economy of China, which I'm particularly interested in, economic development, and international economics. Welcome to the Bridge to China, Dr. Liang.
Yeah, always a pleasure to join you.
Yeah, I'm really delighted to have you. I'd like to get your input because so many Western commentators talk about how China's economy is doing or how it's going to do. Could you tell us, how did China's economy perform in 2025?
Well, I think the growth is very solid, right? That China actually achieved its growth target of 5% growth rate. And again, that's despite a lot of challenges, both at home, but also amid this really geopolitical uncertainty, right? Especially the United States uh, tariffs, right? The tariff war. So I think the growth rate itself is quite remarkable, but I think what is more important is really what we're seeing is the kind of structural transformation, right? The upgrading of the economy, the innovation driven kind of economy, right? So I think the DeepSeek moment really indicates that China is leapfrogging in terms of technological innovation. And of course, it's not just DeepSeek because it's the entire ecosystem that I think is building up in China right now when it comes to AI, right? Starting from, semiconductor chips, now China is a very significant producer of the mature nodes of these semiconductor chips. And it's also making a lot of headways towards the more high-end chips. Then you have all these different models, right? The LLMs that China now, I think, has many of them, at least 180 of very, sort of with a lot of users, right? Very popular kind of AI apps, AI models. Then you also have a lot of these cloud services platforms being set up, and you have a lot of, AI data users. So I think overall the ecosystem is being built up, and China is now, having 60% of the AI patents, leading in the global stage. And AI is not the only, right, sort of the bright spot in China's technological landscape. I think from space exploration, right? When you have Tiangong, you have the Chang'e, which went to the far side of the moon and took back samples. So those are also quite, remarkable achievements. Then you also have other technologies. For example, the Bloomberg has run the report, right? That 2025 was the concluding year of China's Made in 2025 plan, the initiative. So they looked at the 13 industries or technologies that China wanted to achieve self-reliance. And what they found is that out of these 13 industries, China is now leading in 7 of them and catching up in 5 of them. And it's only lagging behind in 1, which is the commercial airplane, the aviation technology. It still has room to go. So I think it's quite, again, amazing that China was able to really develop, its technologies, right? It was in 2017 that China started with this so-called high quality development instead of high speed development. So now you're seeing a lot of these emerging industries being built, NEVs, and lithium batteries, and also the solar panels. So many of these technologies are and these industries are being developed. And so I think you're really seeing the structural transformation in China's economy. And I wanted to just add 2 more things. One is in terms of sustainable development. We're also seeing China is now, the largest producer of renewable energies. Last year, China's solar energy installation has gone up by 14%, and its wind installation has gone up by 50%. So just last year alone, China produced 315 gigawatts of solar energy or installment, right? And so compared to EU, that's 68 gigawatts. And the United States actually had a record year of 35 gigawatts, right? And China produced 315 gigawatts of solar energy. So it's just remarkable when you think about the sustainable growth path. But also, as we all know, that energy is now really the key to the continuous development of AI, right? AI race is pretty much going to be an energy race. So I think in many ways, I think China is really moving ahead. And lastly, of course, is China's excellent trade performance, right? 1.2 trillion trade surplus, despite this tariff war. And again, what is remarkable is not just in terms of the growth, right, the sizable trade surplus, but more importantly, again, is the transformation, the upgrading of the trade structure, right? China, now exports less to the United States, about 20% decline, but now it has, able to pivot to other markets, right? Exported a lot more to ASEAN countries, Europe, South America, and also Africa. And then you also see a lot of the exports are relatively high-tech products, right? The electronics and the mechanics. Those are now mechanical products, and now 60% of China's exports. Not to mention, automobiles, right? So overall, I think, from the domestic economy to its trade performance, we're seeing not only just, in terms of solid growth, but more importantly is that kind of industrial upgrading and the more sort of technological intensive production.
You know, every time you are talking about a particular field of technology, I just think about my daily life in China, and I see those things. Like I went to the National Museum here in Beijing, and there is a sample of moon regolith that China's, got from the moon and brought here to China, and actually I think shared with international partners as well. But I was standing 1 meter from some of the moon, and I was driving from Shandong back to Beijing through Hebei, and we were driving along the coast, and for 4 or 5 hours there was nonstop solar and wind every direction we could see. So it's just remarkable that these realities are not just theoretical, but they're physically transforming the landscape of China. I wanted to ask you a question. I've been covering China for a few years now, and one thing I've noticed is that in the West, they always start with a very low GDP guesstimate about how China is going to perform. And, I think last year IMF said it's going to be 4.2, then later they upgraded to 4.6, and then later they upgraded to 4.8, and then China ended up achieving 5%, which is what China said it was going to accomplish. So my question for you is, in your opinion, why do forecasters in the West tend to underestimate China's growth targets?
Yeah, I think first of all, I echo with your life experience because I went back to China 3 times last year. So I do see all these amazing technologies, and I test drive many EVs, and they're just so cutting edge and they're so sleek. Which is very unfortunate that in the United States we have no more choices other than Tesla, and so I think the tech is changing not only the economy but really people's daily lives. So back to your question, I think last year the early estimate is really having this sort of trade war in mind, right? That because Donald Trump's Liberation Day tariff in April, I think that was really was considered as a very negative and devastating factor for China. But then, as it turned out, China really the export is more than resilient. As a matter of fact, I think again, China was able to very quickly diversify its export destinations, but it's also upgrading its trade structures along the way. And so I think that tremendous efforts and also the remarkable result of that very strong export performance is really what define a lot of these sort of growth forecast. And I also want to mention that a lot of Western media is pointing at China to say that China is engaging in some kind of price war. It's cutting its export prices in order to dump their products into other markets. But I think there are two really important counterpoints to that. One is we're not really seeing China cutting, export price across the board. There's some cuts, especially when it comes to, mid-year, and especially in some of the low-end products. So you're thinking about textiles, toys, shoes, and furnitures, and usually those low value added, really based on price advantages. And also a lot of these products are going into the United States. There were some cuts in prices. But I think what is more important in China's strategy is really to climb up the value chain, right? To be able to sell these very tech intensive and very competitive in terms of good quality, reasonably priced products, not only to the mature markets but also to emerging markets. So I think that is really why you see this really strong export performance, which contributed to close to 33% to China's growth last year. And I would also add, in terms of these Western institutions, I think in some ways I want to say that partly, again, they underestimate China's resilience, they underestimate, China's dynamism, the way that China is able to quickly, shift the gear and come up with sensible policies and make efforts to, push up to lift its economy and push forward. And partly, I think also is to set up some kind of expectation, right? To say that, China's economy is going to doom, and so, don't invest there. So I think in some ways, there is sort of this kind of negative narrative for some specific purposes, right? Which is, again, to form the kind of negative expectation to generate a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. But I think, unfortunately, these negative narratives cannot meet the challenge of reality.
I want to talk about China's real estate sector, but also its deflation overall or relative deflation. We talked about this last time, and you mentioned how deflation was overblown because minus energy and food, it was about, I think you said 0.8%. Is that likely to remain the case? Is real estate hitting the bottom? Do you think, in your opinion, we're going to see moderate inflation this year? What do you think about when you think about this topic?
Right. So I think these two are somewhat related, but not exactly sort of same topic, right? So when it comes to inflation, China actually did not have this deflation, right? So last year the CPI is flat. And when you look at this year, in January, the CPI reading was a 0.2% increase compared to January last year. And then the core CPI is 0.8%. Because there's quite a bit of price reduction in things like pork and other food items. That's why the CPI is lower, but the core CPI, when you exclude price of food and energy, it remains at 0.8%. And also this 0.2%, there is a high base effect because last year, if you remember, the Lunar New Year fell on January the 29th, right? So typically during Lunar New Year, people buy a lot more, and so the price tends to be higher last year in January. So this year, the January CPI is relatively lower, partly due to this high base effect. But again, I think that the inflation rate target was about 2%. So in other words, there is still room to improve that. And I think, again, the Chinese government is aware of this low inflation. And I said it's overblown because, again, there's no deflation and there's no a large demand shift or large demand shock in a negative way, right? Because a lot of people think about deflation was really the United States experience during the Great Depression in the 1930s, which was a very large negative demand shock, right? And so China's sort of a low inflation has a lot more to do with the fast pace of supply expansion, which exceeded the demand expansion. So it's not that the demand is not growing. It's not that demand is declining. It's just the supply is growing faster than demand, right? Again, thanks to this technological innovations, industrial upgrading, and to productivity growth. So that's why I think even if that there's more room for inflation to go up, in other words, there's more room to push up demand. I don't think that China is experiencing any sort of deflation, right? Especially if it's a negative demand shock resulting in deflation. Now, the real estate sector, I have to admit that I had expected that these kinds of real estate sort of slum will bottom out by the end of last year. But it turned out, it seemed that it's going to take a bit longer, right? Because we know real estate sector, the kinds of readjustment is going to take a long time. In Japan, that's decade long of adjustments. In the United States, that resulted in 10 years of, sort of recovery, right? Since 2008, when they had a, mortgage market crash. So usually this will take a long time for the real estate sector to work out, especially for China, where the real estate, at the peak, before 2020's crackdown, it accounted for about 25 to 30% of GDP. So in the broadly sort of defined real estate sector and the related sectors. So it takes time for the real estate to sort of work out, right, in terms of its impact on the broader economy. So I would just say that when you look at the real estate investment last year, it declined quite substantially, 17.3% annual decline last year, right? And then the in terms of the sales was about 12% down. So it will still take some time for the real estate sector to stabilize. Now, that said, I think we're not likely to see the same kind of drag of real estate sector to the economy in 2026, simply because it's not likely that this kinds of large decline in real estate investment is going to continue, right? Because at some point, you still have this demand for real estate. You still have the demand for residential housing, especially if the government relaxes more the kind of housing purchase restrictions. We're likely to see more demand going into that sector as well. And also, I think when some of these real estate developers, once they worked out through this long process, about 5 years now, to work out their debt leverage. To gradually deleverage, I think we will start to see stabilization in this market. And I think the government is now also relaxing a little bit in terms of its control on the leverage ratio for the real estate developers. So I think there are a lot of measures that are put in place. And not to mention, I think, again, the central government is supporting the local government to purchase some of these existing housing stock to use them for social housing. So I think all of these policy support, but also just a natural progression, right, of how the real estate sector works, I think it's likely to start to stabilize this year. Now, of course, real estate is important, but I think more and more we're seeing other sectors, right? Like I mentioned earlier, some of these new trail sectors and other new emerging sectors, low altitude economy, for instance, right? They're gaining a lot more momentum that would help to offset some of these slowdown in the real estate sector. And I think it's also, we're likely to see a lot more support in infrastructure investment this year. So we can talk about that later. But I think, when it comes to infrastructure investment, again, a lot of Western narratives say China is building too much, bridge to nowhere. But the reality is, I think so far, a lot of Chinese infrastructure is generating a lot of positive, externalities or a lot of positive impacts for the broader economy. When you think about high-speed rail or when you think about all these, transportation infrastructure, it really helps you, provide a lot of essential this infrastructure for China's manufacturing and service sector. And I think going forward, China is going to invest a lot more in terms of, upgrading its electric system, right, the grid. So I think all of these will help to offset from the investment drag from the real estate sector.
I just want to throw some anecdotal stories in there because you're again reminding me of my daily experience of living in China. While there may be projects that are having difficulty selling out all of their units in real estate, I've noticed that I went to a place called Taihang Shuizhen, or Taihang Watertown in Hebei, which was a small village raised out of poverty through the Poverty Alleviation Program here in China. And I was just there 2 weeks ago, and I noticed that they are building real estate because it's a very beautiful area and a lot of recent economic activity. And so they're trying to lure people from Beijing and other cities to move there to have these really lovely countryside homes. So even while part of the real estate market may be struggling in maybe big cities, first-tier cities, for example, in other places, it's still very vibrant. So, the experience of being in a country of 1.4 billion people is not just all, one story or one number. It's a very complex, interwoven network of growth. And there's so much more going on than just like some first-tier city units have not been sold. So I just wanted to point that out. From your research, how effective has China's policy been on bolstering domestic demand? Because, our mutual friend, Dr. Warwick Powell, pointed out that Chinese people save about 40% of their income. Today they do, and they did 20 years ago. But income has increased something like 25-fold since 1990. I may have got that figure incorrect, but it's really a massive increase. So even though people are still holding 40% of their income as savings, they're spending a lot more simply because they're making a lot more. So, in your opinion, are Chinese consumers likely to begin spending more? And what are the benefits of Chinese families being so good at saving in the first place?
Yeah, I think, that's an excellent observation. But again, going back to, first of all, again, to echo your observation, I think one thing that people don't realize is that China actually has one of the highest in terms of housing ownership, right? 93%, that is the housing ownership, which is much higher than, these Western economies, which typically have 60% of housing ownership. So you're right, this fast development in real estate, pretty much the 90% of the urban housing in China was built since 1990. So China was able to build enough houses in just a few years than the Western economies built in decades, right? So I think these are remarkable achievements. It's not like, the real estate development is completely a waste, right? It's just, it got overexpanded, over leveraged. And so there is a sort of adjustment process, but it shouldn't really sort of wipe out all the really remarkable achievements when it comes to these kinds of real economic benefits, right, of developing housing and infrastructure. So I completely agree with you. And when it comes to, the household's consumption, and you're absolutely right, Chinese people tend to have a high propensity to save. And you're also right that the Chinese people's, disposable income is actually largely growing on par with the GDP growth rate. So again, many of the Western, critiques say the Chinese people are not spending is because they don't have enough income. That narrative, it's completely misleading, right? Because if the Chinese people don't have enough income, then how can they save so much, right? Because saving is essentially a function of your income. So you can say on the one hand that Chinese people don't have the income and therefore they cannot spend, but then at the same time arguing that Chinese are saving too much and not spending enough. Those two simply can't, they don't square with each other. But yes, I think the Chinese saving rate is high. And I think there are many different reasons, right? There's the cultural factor, there's the historical factor. Part of the reason is, China has this one-child policy. So a lot of the working couples, they're saving for their retirements. They're saving to support their younger children. So that is part of, this kinds of tendency. And also 60% of the household's deposits are more or less for real estate, for purchases of houses. So as you know, in China, most of the time when people buy a house, they don't just put down 20% down payment. Many people, they pay full price for their housing, right? Or they put a large amount of down payments. So that's why I think the Chinese savings high is because they have in mind this money will be eventually spent on, housing purchases, and for their children, and also for education, and so on and so forth. So I think that is the reason for why the household consumption share is relatively low. And I would also add that if you look at the consumption to GDP ratio, it was actually growing since 2012. So since the early 2010s, you start to see this increasing trend of household consumption to GDP ratio. But what happened was it changed in 2020 when pandemic hit, right? So there is a very much, I would say, the scarring effect due to the pandemic, that when people realize that, having some saving for unsustainable future is important. And then came the real estate, slump. And so again, usually people will save their deposits because they wanted to buy houses. But now because of the housing slump, because the price has not stabilized, they kept the money in the bank deposits, right? But when times come, this money will go into real estate purchase, right? So that's why you're seeing now, the Chinese households bank deposits is $23 trillion. And that is a 10% growth from 2024. So this is a large amount of pent-up demand, I would say, right? Some of this money will be, sort of rotating into the equity market, because I see clearly that the many measures from the government trying to shore up and stabilize the equity market to provide a little bit more sort of long-term investment alternative for the Chinese households. And then again, like I said, once the housing market starts to stabilize, and for cities like Beijing, Shanghai, there was always very strong demand. But I can see why the government does not want to completely relax the housing purchase restrictions in those first tier cities, because then you're going to draw a lot of the demand from second or third tier cities, right? So it's not really it's not the overall beneficial strategy for the entire country. But nonetheless, I think the bottom line here is that Chinese disposable income is growing, and it's growing 5% actually last year, exact the same rate as GDP. And the labor income share to GDP is about 60%. That is the same as in the United States and many other countries as well. So it's not that the Chinese people don't have the income to spend, but for all kinds of reasons, economic, social, cultural reasons, and also I would say due to the pandemic scarring effect and real estate slump, there is a more precautionary saving. There's more saving that will eventually be released once things stabilize. And last thing that I would add is that a lot of people, especially again in the West, would say Chinese people save a lot because they have very thin social safety net. I think again we need to have a balanced perspective, right? As a matter of fact, the social services spending or the public service spending, right, social safety net spending has doubled since 2010, and China actually has the basic medical insurance for 1.3 billion people and have the basic pension plan that cover 1 billion people. So it's actually very widespread in terms of social safety net. And Nicholas Lardy, the chief economist in the Peterson Institute of International Economics, actually has done the research and basically found that China's social safety net spending is quite normal when it comes to the same emerging market status as other countries. It's on par with countries like Mexico and Turkey. So it's not like China is not supplying enough social safety net, right? But that said, again, because of population aging and because this initiative to boost domestic consumption, I do think that there's room for the government to continue to beef up the social safety net. And I think that is exactly the direction of travel, right? That you see the government now is increasing, social safety net spending, right, on pensions, and also on a lot of subsidies on, essential services like elderly care, childcare, healthcare. So I think all of these would indicate that there are reasons for the sort of the demand to be relatively soft. But again, it's nothing sort of like the Western narrative, like Chinese consumption is declining, it's collapsing, and all of that, right? I think they are just really worried that the China's consumption is not catching up to its supply, right? Its production growth. And so they worry that, China is going to export a lot more of the products and undercut, their own production at home. So that's why they want the Chinese consumption to grow a lot more. But of course, I think it is in China's interest to boost domestic consumption more. But we have to again have a more balanced and I would say sensible analysis, right, to this argument that Chinese people don't have the money and that's why they can't consume, and that's why they keep this sort of beggar their neighbor policy and dump their products abroad. I think those kinds of narrative is very misleading and it's very distortive. That doesn't really stand the test of, again, empirical evidence.
Well, that's really insightful. I think I learned a lot from your answer there. Thank you so much. I'm really interested in also in China's planning. I think a lot of people are, because it's one of the things that has really helped with the Chinese miracle. I was looking at the 15th five-year plan, and it was talking about one of the many goals on this plan is embodied AI. And there's a place in Beijing called the Robot Mall. And in this robot mall, there's a small robot parents can buy for their children that's about this tall with a screen for a face, and it has embodied AI. And so children can use it when they're sitting there doing their homework to ask it questions, and it just answers them in real time, and it dances, and it's adorable as well. But I mean, obviously this is going to, because this is one of the goals of the 15th five-year plan, embodied AI, we're going to see potentially humanoid robots in our house where you say, okay, go wash the dishes. I mean, that's what I'm hoping for, really. But my question is, What are the core economic priorities outlined in the 15th five-year plan? Because everyone knows that whatever China focuses on, it generally accomplishes. So these are going to be the areas for investors to be looking at, and just, also tech people like me who like to see technology improving, looking at what's coming in the future.
Yeah, excellent question. So I think, as you know, this 5 year plan, right, is really important for China because that helped to really lay out the long term or medium term objective and priorities, right? I think this is, I think, China's strength that it has a long term vision, that it does not change in sort of the short term political cycle or economic cycle. And also, as we know, the plan now really is a guideline, right? It's a blueprint, it's a roadmap that has changed actually since the 11th 5 year plan. It's no longer called 计划, it started to be called 规划. So it's a lot, sort of less micromanagement, sort of a quantitative target, but really the kind of objectives, the priorities, the directions, the policies. So in this newest 5 year plan, which is again very essential, right? Because this is critical for the 2035, so the longer term objective of socialism modernization, right? That is eventually the goal for 2035. So this 5 years from 2026 to 2030 is very important to achieve that goal. And so when it comes to the major initiatives, I think the first two are essentially on the supply side and on the demand side, right? So on the supply side, the objective is to upgrade the traditional industries. So using these new technologies, right, the high technologies, to upgrade the traditional industries. And then the second, related objective of that is to continue to have technological innovations and breakthroughs. So AI plus, right, is definitely the China's AI plan, right, China's AI initiative, which is again the idea that we need to utilize the technologies, but not just to have it as a silo, but really to integrate and adopt the technologies into a varieties of economic activities. So you talk about, the household uses, right, using robots as kids' companion, their tutor, and do some household chores, and the kind of embody AI. And I think that is definitely a very beneficial and very sort of has very high commercial potential, right? Commercial value to utilize AI, right? To commercialize AI. So AI is not going to just stay on your computer as a large language model, right? Now AI can really go into your home and do this kinds of work for you. And AI can also be embedded in terms of the humanoid robots that are in the factories. You can also use AI for autonomous driving. You can use AI for other, industrial production or for other services like delivery drones, right? That could be AI embedded. You could use AI for agriculture, right? So, for example, the number one document, always the first document that is issued by the State Council this year, really emphasize using drones, AIs, and other technologies in agricultural production. So you can, imagine that, in some of the Chinese production in the farming sector, right, that they tend to produce certain products, let's say tea or others that are in the high altitude, mountains, and it's very difficult to the last mileage, either for pickup or for distribution. So you can see there's a lot of user cases for these kinds of technology, right? AI related technologies and related to that drones and others. So I think that is what the Chinese government is aiming for, that AI should not just be a large language model or having the most advanced models, but what is more important is to really embed the AI into various products and into various user cases to promote the general productivity growth, right, in all kinds of sectors. So again, we could talk about these service industries, right, where you can have robots to help the kids to do, educational tasks, right? And you can have AI to do delivery, self-driving, and so on and so forth. So that is a goal. And then the second, I think, related to that, of course, you wanted to continue to achieve technological self-reliance. So long gone, right, are the days when China had to export, 800 million T-shirts in exchange for one commercial airplane, right? So that is, I think, China wants to continue to be able to take control over some of these core technologies, right? Especially not only for economic reasons, right? That once you have the control over the core technologies, you also get the value added. But also, I think for security reasons, as we see that, again, the United States is not a reliable partner, right, when it comes to technological development. So that's why China needs to achieve both technological breakthroughs and the wide adoption of tech, right, to promote the general productivity growth, right, the high quality productive forces. So that is one, I think, overarching and I think the top priority for the government. And related to that, the second top priority, of course, is to boost demand, right? Again, this is not just a consumption demand, but I would argue investment demand is also very, very important. 2025, the fixed asset investment actually has gone down by 3.8%, which is really unprecedented in China's economic history because we all know that Chinese has been a more or less an investment-driven economy. But last year, for all kinds of reasons, right, the real estate slump, the local government debt issues, and the anti-involution campaign, all of this dragged down the fixed asset investments. But I think for 2026, I'm already seeing signs where the government is trying to push more, investments. But I think the key here is they're talking about optimizing investment. So again, we wanted to invest, but we also want to have efficient, right, and sort of investments that would really pay off. That are not, again, like what people would fear, right, the sort of bridge to nowhere. As a matter of fact, I think, again, Chinese government is very aware of that we need to have the long-term growth. We need to have the sustainable investment, right? Some of these investments will be really essential. So I would just highlight two things here quickly when it comes to investment. Why investment is important is because investment is what generates income. Investment is it's when the business expand, right? That creates jobs, and jobs create income, and then income can be spent or saved. So eventually, if you want consumption to grow, you gotta have sustainable job and income growth. And so that boils down to either you would need to have investment demand or you have to have export demand, right? So that is why I think investment demand is still very important. It needs to have a synergetic relationship between investment demand, investment growth, and consumption growth. That's why I think investment growth is important. But again, we need to be optimizing our investment strategies. So for one, I think it's important, as I think the State Grid, right, as we know, the largest utility company in the world, has planned for 4 trillion yuan investment in the 15th five-year plan. And a lot of these would go into some of the traditional, power lines, especially the ultra voltage grid, because we need to have this kind of grid system to be able to utilize all these renewable energy installments, right? We have a lot of renewable energies, but a lot of times the energies cannot be stored or cannot be integrated into the national grid. That means the deployment, right, will be less efficient. So I think it makes great sense for this kinds of investments, right? These investments will definitely pay off, right? It has tremendous benefits to the Chinese economy. So I would say there's definitely investment opportunities. The other area that I would really emphasize is investment in the service sector. The reason for that is also very simple. When you look at China's consumption growth, the fastest growth is in the consumption of services, right? And that's very natural. When people's income grows, they buy enough cars, they buy enough TV set, they buy enough washing machines. The next thing they want to do is to send their kids to the best school, the best enrichment programs. They want to take travel, they want to have entertainment, and so on and so forth. So service consumption has grew by 5.5% last year, right? Which is much higher than the retail sales growth of consumer goods of 3.7%. So there's a lot of room for consumption to continue to grow. But guess what? The investment in service in the tertiary industry was negative last year. I think it's 7% decline, actually, somewhere in that ballpark. Single digits, but it's a decline. So what that shows to me is there's a lot of room for investment to go into the service sector because the future demand is there and because the current investment, it's not there. So this is what I would like to emphasize. It's that if we're thinking about boosting domestic demand, we need to think about both investment and consumption. And there are a lot of focus now on the consumption, but not enough, I think, still on the investment. So we need to, think about both. And I think that for consumption growth this year, there will be headwinds, right? Just because the trading program was so successful last year. So it became difficult when consumers already front-loaded their purchase last year. And this year, we're also seeing some, scale back of some of the support when it comes to trading programs and also when it comes to NEV subsidies. So there will be a little bit more headwind when it comes to the direct support for consumption. But again, I think for people, what is important is they have stable jobs, they have income growth, they have solid social safety nets, and also they have stable expectation about the future. If that can be accomplished, then even without direct consumption subsidies, I think people will still be willing and able and happy to spend.
Well, I always learn so much from having you on the show. I want to talk about China's political economy to some extent, because you're an expert on this, and it is different from the way that Western economies work. What role do state-owned enterprises and policy banks? I noticed recently from a graph that I saw a few times that the 4 largest banks in the world are all Chinese banks. So I'm very curious about that. And what role do these policy banks play in delivering the plan's targets? And why are the largest banks in the world in China? What role do they play? And how does banking different in China than in the West? And how does investment work differently in China than in Western models?
Yeah, again, excellent question. So when you really talk about, the Chinese characteristics, right, of this kind of socialist economy, I think the key is really what state enterprises, including the state commercial banks, play in the economy. And what I would say is they play a really strategic role in not only in terms of the short-term economic growth, but really the long-term economic development and transformation. So I mentioned State Grid. We could also name many others, right, in terms of telecommunications and especially in the financial sector, right? These state-owned enterprises or banks are really essential because they're not just like, Western banks, they're only for profit, maximization. A lot of things that they do is to carry the national strategic goals and at the same time trying to achieve their commercial objectives. So it's a very difficult job, but so far I think they have been doing a brilliant job. So I think the key here is again not to have the financial sort of objective overrides the real economic needs. That is, I think, what the Chinese top leader, right? This is President Xi Jinping has been saying, that finance should be at the service of the real economy. I think, again, in the Western world, we have this very lopsided system where the financial sector is basically now the master, right, of the economy. The real sector is subordinated to the financial interests. Where in China, I think that is the opposite, right? So in other words, what the state banks do is they have the so-called long-term patient capital. So in other words, they invest in projects. They're the backbone of the economy. They may not generate short-term profits, but that does not matter, right? That they're looking at the long term, thinking about the strategic value of their investments. So the policy banks or the state-owned banks, I think they share the similar, sort of the objectives. So what I meant by that is when you look at the policy banks, for example, right, we have the China Development Bank, we have the China Export-Import Banks, and we have the China Agricultural Bank. So many of the large-scale infrastructure is financed, for example, by the China Development Bank. The Three Gorge Dam, right, is one signature project that is funded partly by the China Development Bank. And also Shanghai Pudong Airport and many other transportation infrastructure have these development banks as finance. And also, by the way, last year, the development banks or the Chinese development banks is giving the directive to set aside 500 billion yuan for local government infrastructures sort of seed funds. And so again, that is very important. When the local government now is sort of, many of them are cash strapped, right? There are about 15 provinces that were identified as highly indebted. 12, which means it becomes difficult for them to be able to rolled out any infrastructure project. So the government gives the directives to the development banks, right, and asks them to provide the kind of capital seeds funds for infrastructure projects. And so, as you can see, right, this is important because without the funding, right, a lot of these infrastructure cannot go forward. So the state-owned banks and commercial banks are playing a very key role to provide the kind of bloodline to infrastructure. And I would also say when it comes to some of other, right, when you think about technological development requires a lot of infrastructure as well. Thinking about Internet of Things, you need the 5G. And again, this is not unique to China as well, right? Many countries, even in the United States, in the book Entrepreneurial State, Mazzucato basically said in the US, when you think about technology development, it's largely the government is setting up the infrastructure to allow some of these commercially applicable technologies to develop. And I think China is the same way, right? When you think about what 5G network, right, that has a lot to do with, China's telecommunication companies to lay out this sort of the network. And again, a lot of this is funded by the top four, right? That's the major bank lending, the bank lenders. So giving all this, again, I just wanted to emphasize that because finance is at the service of the real economy, and because these state-owned commercial banks are not only profit-driven, they're able to really think long-term and envision projects that would not only promote short-term economic growth, but really the sort of long-term strategic goals of achieving high-quality development.
That's fascinating. We are the bridge to China. We try to, pardon me, we try to connect the West and the East. So, U.S.-China relations. What is your assessment of the current China-U.S. trade relationship in 2026? Is Trump coming to China in April? And what might be the agenda of such a meeting between President Xi Jinping and President Donald Trump?
Yeah, so I do think that 2026 would likely to see some stabilization, right? Continuing from last year's Busan meeting between the two leaders. And I think Trump has been touting the April trip to China, and it seems that's likely to happen. I think the two leaders just had a phone call last week. We don't know exact detail and exactly what the initiation of this phone call was, but we do know they talked about Taiwan, and China's readout really emphasized on the Taiwan issue, and the American readout largely focused on China's promise to buy more soybean. So there's a mismatch in terms of readout, but my suspension is that my speculation is that they probably talked about the trip, right, because it's coming up, and so I think there should be some sort of arrangements. So I think bar from any major shocks, I do think that the trip is likely for Trump to visit China, and I think that it is in China's interest, right, to have the stable relationship with the United States. It's not only conducive for China's own economic development, right, to be able to focus on development, but I think from China's point of view, this is also a responsible thing to do, right, because these are the two largest economy in the world, and when the elephants fight, the grass is trembled. So I think from China's point of view, right, China wants to be a responsible stakeholder, so it does want to have a stable relationship with the United States. Now, from Trump's perspective, I think he seemed to pivot a little bit more now to the Western Hemisphere, and I also think that given that he knows that China has the cards, right, not only is the rare earths, but also essential ingredients in pharmaceuticals and others. I do see that now he's probably going to have to think twice if they wanted to, pull the trigger again and get another fight with China. That's probably not going to be in the interest of the United States. And I also think that Trump always, sort of label himself as a deal maker. So if he's able to, quote unquote, make some deal with China, right, then he will consider himself as, that would be a big legacy for his administration. So given that, I think there is a common interest for both sides to meet and try to stabilize the relationships. Now, that said, I don't have really high expectations in terms of what they can accomplish in this one trip or multiple trips, because apparently, President Xi would also reciprocate and visit the United States in the fall. But I think these kinds of communications definitely, right, are super helpful at the highest level. But at the same time, I don't know, given the structural and strategic differences, I'm not sure they can really strike a sort of grand bargain, right? I think for China, of course, if the two countries can reach some sort of a Taiwan communique, right, the fourth one, and really make it very clear, right, China's stance and really protect, China's interest, the core interest, right? That will be ideal. But I think that is a very tall order, right? That's going to be very difficult to do, right? Unless I think at one point, if Trump really decided to pivot away from the Indo-Pacific, and also when Taiwan has moved enough semiconductor production design from Taiwan to the United States, then maybe they will relax a little bit more on that front. But at least at this point, I don't see that happening. So what I see the potential outcome and the sort of deliverables of these meetings would be an extension of the trade truce, right? Because let's not forget the trade truce was only 1 year, right? So it's likely that they're going to extend that, and so there will be some sort of thawing in terms of the trade tensions between the two. And it is likely that China will continue to pledge to purchase more soybean. But again, I think what Trump is asking, like 25 million metric tons, I think that is way too much. I don't see China needing that much more of in terms of strategic stockpiling, and not to mention, China is able to buy it from Brazil at a cheaper price and so on. But I do think that that's a possibility, and China is also very likely to buy more LNGs coming in this year. Although whether or not they're going to buy from the United States, that's still a question, right? But I think that is another possibility, some kinds of energy trade deals, because China does need more, LNG imports. And then there are other smaller things that I think potentially there could be some sort of deals. For example, the acquisition of Manus, an AI company, right? That I think now China's government is still looking into it. So there are some low-hanging fruits, I would say, for both sides to kind of, each take a step back and relax a little bit of trade tension. But other than that, I'm not seeing a lot more sort of accomplishments through these meetings or any sort of breakthroughs in terms of the relationships.
I'm not an economist, but I like to imagine what it might be like if the Western countries learned from China's economic model. So I wanted to ask you as an economist, when you think about China's green tech, EVs, breakthroughs in other technologies, the use of SOEs to provide stability. I mean, one of the things I've noticed just by living here is there's never a bust boom cycle in China. There's never really a major financial crisis. Even if things start to just grow slightly less, everyone in the world freaks out. Oh my gosh, their GDP went down a little bit, but it's still growing like twice as fast as the US. When you envision what you would do if you had control of a Western economy, what lessons do you think Western economies can learn from China's model?
There are so many. But again, I think, for one is really think about the general public's interest, right? Instead of the small, financial elites, or now the tunnel, elites, that the narrow, right, interest. So what I'm saying is, the United States economy is so hijacked by these kinds of financial interests, right? Not only the financial sector is so speculative, it's so with all these different cryptocurrencies and other speculative schemes, and also the sort of the shareholder maximization kind of financial interests that are they're hijacking the real production, the real economy. I think that is really something that they could learn from China. The finance should be at the service of the real economy, and same goes with technology, right? So we're seeing all these AI capex spending that is driving the U.S. economy. But again, how much that really translates into jobs and income and productivity for the ordinary people, right? I think that is really a big question mark, because you see these technocrats, right? The Elon Musk, I don't know how much his personal values now. I mean, 200 something billion dollars. or 800 some billion dollars. I mean, I already lost track. I think it's 800 billion something. But the point is that, when you think about Tesla, when you think about BYD, right? Tesla is definitely much a higher worth in terms of the company, and of course, personal wealth of Elon Musk just snowballed. But how much, their cars are, serving the interests of people, right? How much they're upgrading their cars, how much they're lowering the price so then it could price in and make it more affordable, right, for ordinary Americans. So all of these, I think, are something that, the U.S. economy can learn, right? To think about really the general public interest, right? So I think these days, the kill line has become so catchphrase, right, in both U.S. and China's media, social media. So I think that is real. Like there's very little fallback system for average people. A divorce, a job, a layoff, or a medical bill, that's enough to push otherwise financially healthy family into, homelessness, right? So I think that is definitely one thing that the U.S., in terms of the overall the economy is wealthy, right? It's affluent, it's large, but then when it comes to daily people, lives, right? They're 60% of the people, they still live paycheck to paycheck. They don't have federally, paid sick leave and so on and so forth. I mean, just the list goes on. How, this economic sort of seemingly prosperity does not translate into, better living standards for people, right? The stock market's booming, but guess what? Over 93% of the stock is owned by only 10% of the top, American income, the top income people. So I think that is just one thing that is fundamentally different in terms of, what exactly the economy serves, right? Whose interest the economy serves. In addition to that, I think what is really important, again, is the kind of long-term vision, right? That the kind of stability in your political, in your economic system, that it's not like, during Joe Biden, you have this green economy, initiative. And then once Trump got in, everything was wiped off and, everything's retreated. So I think the kinds of longer term vision, right, the consistency in some of these policy objectives and goals, I think that, again, is something that the U.S. and other Western economies should really be working on. Because, again, the planet, right, it's what we need to really care about. Sustainable, economy is what it's really important. And people's livelihood, right, people's living standards is really what matters. And I think in that sense, I think the Western system really failed to deliver any of these really important goals and objectives.
I really like your initial focus on people, because I think that's where Americans really feel left out. A lot of people are on red note now in the United States. They're looking at people in China and they're shocked at the level of, comfort that Chinese people, because, Chinese people tend to make less. The median income in China is lower, but because there's 93% home ownership and 80% of those people own their home outright, Chinese people can spend their money as they please. I interviewed a Chinese influencer named Kenny Wow. He lives in what he calls a fifth-tier city. I'm not sure if that even exists. But he says he goes out every single meal. I know that a lot of the Americans watching that interview were probably really jealous and shocked. So, the emphasis on helping everyday Americans, I think, is really important. And I think that China does that really astoundingly well. I go to poverty alleviation villages every weekend to explore and understand how this process took place and is still taking place. And I see people who, were totally impoverished, 15, 20 years ago, and today are living really nice, affluent lives. It's really just amazing what China did in such a short period of time. That is all the time that we have, though. I'd love to ask you more questions. We'd love to have you back on the show. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Liang.
Yeah, no problem. Always a pleasure. I hope to talk to you soon again. Happy New Year.